Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Dialexicon podcast, a podcast targeted at the youth, where we critically engage in philosophy and correlate philosophy research to contemporary and social issues, all at an easy and understand digestible level. Although there was a bit of a break and hiatus with the episodes for the past 2 months, everything's back to normal, and you should be seeing episodes on a weekly basis and maybe even more frequently. My name is Saurish and I'm your host. This week, we're joined by Professor Bayruns García, who is currently a fellow in residence at the Edmond and Lily Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University, and later in the fall will be an assistant professor in philosophy at McMaster University. Hi, Dr. Garcia. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing awesome this fine morning. I just wanted to thank you for your time and for being here today. Before we begin our discussion, I ask all my guests this question just because I think it provides everyone who's listening a really cool story about how people got into philosophy. So how did you get into philosophy, and what stood out to you in philosophy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my first philosophy class was on 9/11. That is the 9/11, September 11th, 2001, and it was scheduled for right before the planes hit the towers. And I was going to school at LaGuardia Community College at the City University of New York, not too far from where 9/11 happened. And it was a morals and ethics class, which I kind of just accidentally signed up for as my first college class, period. And when you kind of contrasted those events plus the kind of engaging in ethical reasoning and all this that we were doing in this class, I didn't know exactly what it meant to be a philosopher, but I did know as soon as I saw this particular philosopher or teacher, instructor at LaGuardia Community College, get into issues like having to do with trolley cars and Kantian ethics and so on. I thought, well, I need this gentleman's job, but I didn't know what that meant at the time. Now I have a better idea, I think. So that's how I got into philosophy. I had no idea what philosophy was really beforehand, until I really encountered philosophy in this particular time and particular setting.
Okay, yeah, I think like a lot of people, who are like on the like past guests will tell me that like college is the first time that they see philosophy, which hopefully this podcast is trying to change. And I just want to ask you just like your background in philosophy now, like the research areas that you focus on, and how did you kind of transition from moral and ethics to those areas?
Yeah, good. So I specialize in philosophy of race, Latin American philosophy, and epistemology. Although everything I do tends to have some kind of epistemological slant or orientation towards it, I would say. I just can't help myself in that regard. So yeah, I actually got into grad school thinking I wanted to be a democratic theorist. Doing some kind of social political philosophy. But when I encountered democratic theorists, they tended to have this idea of democracy such that we actually have it in the US, which by my lights, if someone like Charles Mills or folks in that camp of philosophy are right, we have probably never had anything like a robust democracy. So I realized that democratic theory probably wasn't for me. And then I encountered a lot of feminist epistemology and the epistemic and justice literature, and this whole literature that looks at how or examines how power relations or social political things relate to things like knowledge and understanding, whether individuals understand what they understand, what they're ignorant of. So I got really interested and have never really stopped being interested in how power relations or injustice relates to what people believe, whether they're justified in their beliefs, whether they have understanding, and so on.
Okay, yeah, I mean that makes sense. I think there's a lot of questions like surrounding race in general in America and kind of its relationship to also to the democratic atmosphere as a whole, or like politics as a whole, I guess. So definitely like still maybe in race, there's kind of like a relationship to the socio-political atmosphere that you can also embrace. And I guess I wanted to just introduce race as a whole to the podcast and to like for this episode. What exactly is race, and what does it mean for race to be a social construct?
Yeah, good. So yeah, there are a lot of in the philosophy literature, there's a debate about what race is, right? Metaphysically, what is race? So the predominant view these days, I would say, is what you already mentioned, a social constructionist view. And those come in a variety of flavors. So, but what the basic thrust of the social constructionist view is that race, whether you count as white, black, or indigenous, or Latinx, or Asian, or whatever, depends on how society is structured, and more importantly, what people believe, right? So that people have beliefs about race results in different groups being treated differently. And that difference in treatment um, is in part what we're referring to when we refer to race. So, and this on the social constructionist view, right? This idea of race. So on most constructionist views, race is this new concept we came up with sometime after 1492, right? When Iberians and Columbus and others accidentally arrived in the Americas, and you had exploitation of certain kinds prop up, and then you had these ideas of race developing that to justify these different kinds of exploitation, and then you got over time the kind of solidification of these ideas in people's heads, and you get this hierarchy. So to that's what I think most people are thinking of, at least in the philosophy literature, when they're talking about social construction, right? We have ideas, and then these ideas result in different kinds of treatment for different groups over time.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And so you mentioned that it's like, again, like something that's like socially constructed after 1492. So I'm curious about what that means in terms of how we're like people nowadays interpret race. So like, does that mean that it's tied to like biological traits? Are there certain things or certain factors that contribute to people actually contributing to racism, or I guess people actually seeing race, or maybe even like why race is a question on a lot of forums, like what kind of race you are, and like why are those things still kind of perpetuated in society, if it's something that's socially constructed and there's knowledge that it can be removed if it's socially constructed and it's not tied to like biology or something.
Yeah, that's a good question. So um, there was this move in the early 80s where someone like Anthony Appia, very prominent philosopher of race and political philosopher, he tried to say, look, race isn't real, biologically speaking, and it has all of these bad consequences like racism and racial injustice. So therefore, we shouldn't use race, right, as a concept, right? Because using race, one, in terms of like the metaphysics, there's no such thing. So it's like referring to ghosts. There's no such thing. So we shouldn't refer to ghosts, ontologically speaking or metaphysically speaking. And guess what? Using the terms black, white, and so on result in racism and racial injustice. And so therefore, we should just eliminate. There's this view called eliminativism. We should eliminate race from use in society. But then there's this other group who are called conservationists. So the conservationists think, yeah, of course, a race isn't biologically real in any deep sense, right? Race isn't this view that different races have different essences or different qualities that depend on racial membership. That view is false. But it is true that race is socially real. So when we talk about black and white, we are talking about real people, groups of people who have been treated differently over time. And actually, if we want to ameliorate or deal with this thing called racism, racial injustice, it for the conservationist about race, they think, no, we need to keep on referring to Black people and white people, because if we don't refer to Black or white people, it's going to be quite difficult to ameliorate racism, right? So, and here, this is kind of mapping on to this. So to get this across, before the Civil Voting Rights and Civil Rights Act in the mid 1960s, segregationists in the South were very happy to distinguish between white and Black people, right? So that they did that to maintain their dominance and subjugate Black folks in the South, for example, or Mexicans in Texas or whatever. But then once Black folks and Mexican folks, but especially Black folks, got maybe something like equal formal rights and by the lights of the law, or in terms of what's enshrined in law, those same segregationists were very unhappy to use Black and white. Why? Because say Black folks wanted to use referring to themselves and other races as a way to ameliorate things. So there's this thing called, this gets confusing, but say conservatives, politically speaking, in the US, right? They don't want to refer to race. Why? Because they don't want to ameliorate or deal with the effects of slavery and Jim Crow in the US. So they want race neutral policy. But race neutral policy just allows the effects of slavery and all kinds of injustices that have to do with race to keep going unabated over time. So really what the conservationists about race is saying is, no, we need to keep using these terms, because without using them, without referring to race and racial injustice, we don't have a chance of ameliorating or dealing or remedying racial injustice. So that's why we have this, we have these categories on the forms of that we fill out for, bureaucracies, Black, white, and this, because it has to do with, or at least the hope is that it has to do with ameliorating racial injustice.
Okay, and I just wanted to like confirm, so this is similar to like when people will throw around the phrase like I don't see color, or like an essential like color blindness, as you will. So like that is kind of something that doesn't acknowledge race as it is, like as it has been. And so in that, like because of that, it's actually counterintuitive to what the original statement actually says. Is that correct?
Say that last bit again, sorry.
So like rather than saying like, so I think the intention behind like I don't see color is to say that like I'm not trying to be racist, or like I have no distinction between race, but rather by saying that statement, you're like refusing to kind of recognize the histories of racism and how it affects different individuals. And so by that accord, you were technically insofar like being racist, right? Or in a way contributing to that same thought, or not ameliorating racial injustice, as you said. So is that correct?
That's right. So when people say, one way of interpreting an individual who says or claims, I don't see color, it's a way of them saying, I'm not acknowledging that the past injustices in the world affect people now, right? And the thing is, it's the dominant group that tends to want to see color. Why? Because they've benefited from centuries of accruing opportunities and wealth and so on. So now that they've accrued this, it's very convenient. It makes psychological sense, right? So for the average white person to say, well, they would, and this gets into some of my own work, the average white person in the US will want to deny that the past affects the present. Why? Well, because they've benefited in all kinds of ways from the hoarding of resources and opportunity and so on. So even though let's suppose things are equal now, which I don't think they are, but let's suppose they were, you'd still have this asymmetry in opportunity in terms of, and not only opportunity, but also in wealth. And wealth also leads to opportunity. So that's kind of exactly what I think you've nailed it right on the head in terms of color blindness and what people mean, or how we should interpret instances where people say, oh, I don't see color.
Okay, and I do want to ask kind of about the relationship specifically with race and power. So from what you've been talking about, it seems that they go hand in hand. And so I'm wondering now, because the way that power works is like almost that if there is something that you can use to maintain power, you will always use it, which I guess is a reason for why race has persisted throughout centuries. So is there a replacement for race? Is there something new that has taken place to replace race or maintain power for those different dominant groups?
Yeah, this is a great question. So there's this debate about in philosophy and critical race theory and maybe even in the social sciences more generally about, does the concept black and does the concept white, right? Because we use these terms and they're in part conceptual terms that have certain content, right? So when I use the term black, uh, it's going to invoke certain kinds of content that have to do with a group that's struggled to, gain rights and all kinds of things over time, right? And white will connote or invoke certain content of a group who's subjugated other groups over time, and so on. And indigenous will invoke certain content of folks who've been dispossessed by land and so on. But the debate is, what kind of content do these terms necessarily carry? So some people think the term white necessarily is like going to have some kind of negative component to it, right? And therefore, we should eventually do away with the term white. There's no world in which we can have white and black people where there isn't some kind of hierarchy or what we might call racist structure to society. Other people don't think that. They think, no, we can have societies where there are white and black and indigenous and Latinx and Asian folks, where really what we're talking about are maybe different cultures and different histories, but there doesn't have to be this necessary hierarchy or injustice due to different power relations or one group having more power over another. And that's a very live debate. I tend to think our concepts don't have to have anything at all. And this way, I'm kind of a Humean, right, following David Hume about concepts, despite his racist comments in the 1700s about Black folks and his thoughts about white folks. But he has this view about what you kind of think you can accept without accepting his racism, which is, well, the content of our concepts really is just going to be a result of the environments we're in, right? So I think if we change the material conditions of the world in a certain way, then we can have white and black folks that, right, and we can use these terms without necessarily contributing to what we call a racial injustice or racism or what have you. But this is there's another group of folks who I hold in high regard, Afro-pessimists. They think actually, no, like this world we're in is necessarily a racist one, and there's certain consequences as a result of that in terms of trying to fight against racism and how individual Black folks orient themselves towards U.S. society. And you know what? I'm not even so certain about it. This is a difficult question, but there are there's good work being done on both sides of this debate.
Yeah, and I just wanted to also mention that there is a great book by Frank Wilderson III on Afro-pessimism, if you're interested in that. And I did want to ask, just going back a little bit on the way that race is, maybe taught or seen through the lens of a young person, or at a young age as they're growing through society. How do we learn about race? And then is it something that we're born with? And maybe you had a paper called are our racial concepts necessarily essentialist due to our cognitive nature? So what did you conclude in that paper, and how does it relate to how we develop as humans experiencing or seeing racial groups and racial injustice as well?
Right, great. So this is a good question. It's a tough question. So there is this social psychology literature that takes up how, at what ages do people begin to use some of these identity terms, such as racial terms or gender terms, right? Man, woman, boy, girl, Black, white, Latinx, or indigenous or Asian or whatever. And the literature seems to show that gender gets picked up earlier by children, ages, I think, like as early as 3, 4. Children begin to use the terms like boy and girl when picking out who they're friends with or prefer to be friends with, or people in their world, right? Social world. But in terms of race, it actually happens a little bit later on, more like, I think it was, if I can't recall the exact dates, but it's just a bit after that. So say 5 or 6, or maybe as early as 4, but no earlier than that. So that suggests that, well, to answer part of your question, we're not born with these racial concepts, right? We're not hooked up. We may be hooked up. The social psychology literature does show that we're hooked up to see the world in terms of in and out groups. That we do, seems we're hooked up to do that, and probably for reasons that have to do with evolutionary fitness, right? But it seems like, yeah, the race thing is something we just learned, or as now I'm saying we in terms of society, and individuals learn these things as children, and they don't have them coming out of the crib, as it were. So therefore, it's not something that we necessarily have. But as far as what I concluded in that paper, so let me give you. So there's Ron Mallon and another author, I believe his name is Daniel Kelly. They argue that, look, we have, it seems, if you look at some of the evidence in the psychology literature and maybe cognitive science literature, we have these kind of innate mechanisms that kind of result in us having racial concepts that are fixed, right? They think as a result of our cognitive nature, we have race concepts like black and white that are necessarily essentialist, where that means that these concepts will tend to involve the view or content that, oh, white folks are superior to black folks in some way, cognitively or morally or whatever, right? This is the kind of essentialist content that we've had for centuries, which thankfully there is less prominent, but unfortunately still out there. And I think actually I disagree with that finding, because they focus on the US and the kind of content we've had as a result, in US race relations, right? And US race concepts. But the thing is, when you look to other parts of the Americas, and let's just focus on the Western Hemisphere, if you look at the Dominican Republic or Brazil or what have you, race there doesn't have this essentialist content in the same way, right? So the content will differ. So in the Dominican Republic, race terms don't have this kind of intellectual component. Race terms there, so being black or being white, has more to do with kind of like aesthetic value and maybe to some degree moral value, but it doesn't have this intellectual component, and it's much more scalar or than the kind of dichotomous black-white thing we have going on in the United States, for example, or Canada maybe. So this fact that race works in this different way across Latin America, and from place to place, these race terms have different content. Now they're coming from an original source and a similar explanation, but it shows that, on my view, if race term content is varying the way it does in Latin America, it's just not, it suggests that race terms don't necessarily have this kind of essentialist content, right? That's the basic, one of the basic conclusions of the book. Yeah.
And so, like, I guess talking about like the distinction between race in America and race in other areas, maybe specifically the Western Hemisphere. So that distinction specifically, is that tied to like cultural like the cultural way that people have interpreted race over a period of time, because it is social? So like different regions will have different understandings of race. What would happen if someone from Brazil goes into America? Do they adopt the racial understanding in America, and vice versa? How does that work?
Yeah, no, that's so my family is from the Dominican Republic, where race terms work very differently. So let's take the Dominican Republic. there are two parts of the Dominican Republic. There's this valley called El Cibao, and then there's this part which is associated with the capital, and they're divided by some kind of very big mountains, and you had different forms of labor going on in the two places. One place in the south had more to do with sugarcane production, and in the north you had more cattle. Now it turns out that when you're raising cattle, you know, if you have a slave, your slave's also on a horse next to you, kind of at the same level as you, doing the same things, sharing the same meals when you're grazing out there, right? When you're herding cattle or whatever you do with cattle. Whereas in sugarcane plantation, that's a much more hierarchical thing where you have one overseer on a horse going around making sure people are doing the work. So this is really Frank Moya Pons, this historian from the Dominican Republic's view. This kind of resulted in different and more lax miscegenation attitudes in the certain parts of the Dominican Republic where you had more racial mixing, right, between populations, and that has resulted in kind of different concepts of race. So here I'm painting a picture of kind of the material conditions in a place resulting in different content in the race terms we have. Now, you still have black and white in these places, but they function really differently. And the explanation I'm pointing to is one that has to do with kind of the division of labor or material conditions.
Okay, yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I guess I also want to move into a little bit of like a different topic that you've worked on, which is kind of like information flow, which I guess is more so epistemological. And so you have this paper called Racial Injustice and Information Flow. And I wanted to ask first, what is information flow? Second, what are ways that racial injustice can actually embed itself within an information flow?
Yeah, good. So information flow is, to give you the way I conceive of it, is we can think of society, right? And, suppose that here I am in the Boston area, and in the Boston area, we know or we have the true belief that, I don't know, that the Red Sox will win the World Series. Suppose that's true, despite the prejudice here about that. And suppose in other parts of the country, people don't share this belief or something like that. Now, suppose it really is true, right? That's a true belief. It's not just one that we want to believe. That information can either be, right now it's residing in one part of society, and now I'm doing it geographically, and it could move to other parts of society through sharing information on the internet, word of mouth. But guess what? In New York, that information is probably not going to be received well because they think or want to believe that the Yankees will win the World Series. So there you're going to have information not flowing from, say, Boston to the New York area, or at least there'll be a kind of, the tendency will be for that information not to arrive there. So now we can see, well, US society has, in terms of this one bit of information, right? That this one bit information is not really flowing from one part of society to another. Now we can do it non-geographically. We can say across different strata of society, from black or white folks in the same city, or across class, or across gender, or across different kinds of jobs or economic positions or whatever. Information may flow or not, and so that's information flow. And the thing I do with information flow is I explain how racial injustice impedes information about racial injustice itself, right? So to give you an example, 60%, according to a Pew Research Center poll, I think that was done in about 2020, 2021, 60% of white Americans in the US believe that the US has gone far enough or done enough to remedy racial injustice. Now, I think there's lots and lots of information or evidence that suggests that that's false, meaning that the US hasn't done enough. But 60% of white Americans hold this false belief, or even a better one. There was a study run right after the murder of Eric Garner. Eric Garner was a Black man who was selling loose cigarettes outside of a bodega or a convenience store in Staten Island, New York. And he was murdered by new NYPD officer Pantaleo, and because of an illegal chokehold that he was taken down with, that is, Eric Garner was taken down with. And according to this poll run or study run right afterwards, 90% of white persons in New York State believe that the officer was not guilty, not guilty. But I think the evidence in terms of the video clearly shows that he employed an illegal chokehold for what was a minor infraction. So I think let's call that belief false, that 90% of whites have. Now, that 90% of that's an example of information not flowing, right? So what Black folks almost have the reverse. I think it was something like 90% of Black folks thought that Officer Pantaleo was guilty, right? So here you have two bits of society, Black folks and white folks, and information is just not moving, right, across from one group to the other. So so there's this general notion of information flow, which you rightly kind of parsed out. And then I'm using that to examine how power relations, and specifically racial power and justice as a power relation, affects whether information flows across society.
Okay, yeah, and I guess there's like a recent news example of like, Florida's government banning AP Black History, which is a curriculum that the College Board has put out for schools to adopt. And I think Florida cited that it lacked educational value. So would this be an example of, racially unjust information flow, where I guess now or I guess like maybe even like racially unjust information flow about racial injustice in the context that like these governments are trying to forward that these don't even matter. There's a lack of it. There's not educational value in it. And then, so is that, first of all, is that like an example of kind of like this phenomena of racial injustice in information flow?
Yeah, so yes, I think so. And the way I would put it is racial injustice explains why, in this case, in the DeSantis Florida case, why racial injustice, information about racial injustice doesn't flow. So you have the phenomenon like so racial injustice, the way I think of it, is a way that society's organized, politically speaking, right? It's the way society's structured due to things like chattel slavery, Jim Crow, indigenous land dispossession, colonial interventions by the US in the Americas. All these things is what I think kind of compose racial injustice. So that phenomenon explains why we have this thing going on with DeSantis. Why is he passing this legislation? And other states too, like I believe New Mexico and Arizona passed this legislation, similar legislation. Well, because they have a constituency that they're appealing to that finds this to be good legislation. Now, why do they find this to be good legislation? Because white folks in the US, and here I'm picking on white folks, but we could talk about men. We could talk about heterosexual people. I think the phenomenon obtains for dominant groups in general, but white folks in the US are an especially dominant group that have been under-theorized in philosophy, for sure. So white folks in the US have this tendency to want to reject this information, right? So here comes along DeSantis saying, hey, we're going to reject this information wholesale. So you have this psychological tendency of whites as a dominant group colliding with a politician who, I don't know if DeSantis believes any of the things he says or not. It kind of doesn't matter. But he knows as a politician, he's going to do well by passing this legislation because of the tendency his white constituency has. And so here you have a tendency in individuals that's due to racial injustice. And that explains why racial injustice information isn't flowing.
And then there's a follow-up question on this, just specifically because it's something that I was curious about, but like, should an AP course like this exist for all ethnic groups? And why is it singled out for Black history? Is it something to like ameliorate Black and like historical injustices towards the Black community? Or what is the reasoning behind that? Or is it like, and maybe this is something we can maybe talk about with like cancel culture in the future, but like there seems to be a really big push for justice for Black Americans or like Black history in overall. So is this just something that College Board is trying to do to push that narrative for its own organization?
So, I mean, there's this very good book by, it's called The Lies My Teacher Told Me, right? Lowen, I forget his first name right now, but it's a very good book that canvasses US history textbooks. And there's another one by Francis Fitzgerald on US history textbooks. And US history textbooks are just horrid in terms of the omissions in terms of US history. The way they portray Columbus is almost entirely false or misleading. The way they portray people like Jefferson in terms of slavery or Washington or Reconstruction after Civil War. So for centuries, or as long as we've had US history textbooks, the picture that's been painted in those textbooks of the US, and you can't understand, I think, the US without understanding Black history, right? Black history just is US history, and Indigenous history and Latinx history and Asian history. But Black history especially, right, has just been totally not made out appropriately. That is in terms of the truth. And that's a good reason why college boards or educational people who control educational curricula at the state level, they really don't have as much control as you might think. So a lot of this is overblown in terms of the effect that this legislation will have on educational curricula at the college or university level. But at any rate, these are to implement an ethnic studies program or a Black studies program is just one small drop in the bucket in terms of doing better by way of presenting the truth about American history, right? So focusing on Black studies as opposed to other groups is just is justified, I'd say, at least in one sense, and I think justified in many, is that this group Black American history has been portrayed so poorly, and for some of the same psychological tendencies that I already invoked earlier. So yeah, and you'll see that Mexican American history in Arizona is this getting the same pushback, and not only Arizona but also California. So I think, yeah, this is, if you just look at actually how history's been portrayed, we need this not only at the university level, but we need this through the K through 12 educational level in terms of the truth being presented appropriately.
Okay, yeah, that makes like a ton of sense. And I guess like another question about information flow, just because of the recent boom in AI, is like, can algorithms or complex algorithms learn to be racist through information flow that they're getting fed into by, like, I don't know, like the data that they get access to or something like that?
Yeah, I think yes is the question, the answer rather, to that question. And really, it's a kind of trope, but I think it's true. You get garbage in, garbage out in vis-a-vis these algorithms. So algorithms or chat GPT or whatever, all these different programs, they are only, they're getting information from the culture we've produced, right? Culture is just in part composed of information and practices, and the information that's getting into these programs, when it comes to, say, race relations or whatever, are, well, in large part, not entirely. I think people are trying to do better by way of this in terms of coders and programmers and so on. But these algorithms and AI will in part just reflect the kind of society we've had, which has been a deeply racist society, structurally racist society, sexist society, and along lots of other dimensions of identity, these AIs will, I think, tend to be racist in some form or other. Although I do know that folks at many of these folks at Google or wherever are sensitive to this, but I don't know how sensitive they're being. I mean, I just don't know.
Yeah, definitely. I think that makes sense. And maybe that's a reason for also like the continuation of race within society. It's just like these cultural texts or the way we produce information. has inherently been also racist, so it's going to persist throughout society just because it's being reinforced almost. Um, and so, I wanted to get into, a question about cancel culture, just because cancel culture and race, like maybe like if you've seen ever throughout like Twitter or like anything, it seems that there's a really big relationship between race and cancel culture, and how it like affects different celebrities. And I wanted to ask you, like, what is your opinion on cancel culture, and how does it relate to like knowledge or even learning, for the individual who's being canceled?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I think cancel culture is a term that, right, it exists only because we have things like Twitter and we have Facebook and we have all these, TikTok, whatever, all these social media that allow people, lots of people, to have their voices heard, right? It like magnifies opinions, right? And sometimes in very pernicious ways, but not always pernicious. So when someone is canceled, so take Charlie Rose, a reporter who had a kind of very prominent hourly interview show. He was canceled because of very inappropriate behavior. But what does cancel mean here? So what happened was, and in many of these cases where people had been canceled, you have people engaging in inappropriate behavior of some kind, and then people voicing in this very magnified way through social media that this is inappropriate. And then you have corporations who are sensitive to what the majority thinks because they want to continue to accumulate capital, right? Make profits, reacting and firing people on this and that. So I think it's really just cancel culture is just a way of talking about uh, it's just a way of talking about what a lot of people think, and sometimes that's going to be good, and people will be canceled, lose their job because their employer sees that it and continuing to employ one person or another is not popular, and that they will suffer in terms of accumulating capital, making a profit. But sometimes, uh, people can the majority of people can be wrong, right? As Plato was very wary of. But I tend to be more confident in democracy. So I think a lot of people who want to castigate cancel culture are often very wary of democracy. They don't like what the majority of people think. Now, so, we live in a very deeply racist, sexist society, and a lot of people think those kinds of things. And maybe someone will be so-called canceled um, for racist or sexist reasons when they shouldn't have been. But this is just a part of like living in a democratic society where now more people have a voice. And what we need to do is actually try to, by we I mean society, society should try to regulate itself and towards instructing people in the truth. And this is going back to information flow. uh if if people were doing better by way of racist and sexist beliefs, then we'd have less worry about people getting on Twitter and voicing that some person should be fired. But in many instances, people who have been canceled um probably should have been canceled, like Charlie Rose or um whatever powerful person in Hollywood or whomever. But the process, no process is perfectly reliable in its outcomes, right? So there will be some bad instances. But it's how, so I guess cancel culture um, relates to knowledge in one way, maybe, if we can do this in a kind of nappy epistemological formulation, or, you know, if someone has knowledge vis-a-vis racial injustice or sexism or something like that, then, or if enough people have knowledge, I should say, then the outcome of some kind of magnified view on Twitter, which people are calling cancel culture, will be fine. So where now, if someone has knowledge, if they have a true belief, at least, and they have a justified belief, right? So really, we don't even need knowledge. As long as people have true beliefs, cancel culture will be fine. We'll be canceling the right people. And the thing that people don't discuss, which I kind of invoked already in terms of cancel culture, is really just a consequence of, at least partly a consequence of corporations wanting to maintain favor with the people who are spending money, right? So you get this magnification of views, and you get a response from people who want to continue to profit. I mean, that seems pretty natural, actually.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense, and definitely interesting how like capital comes into play with race. And there is actually an episode on that on the Dialexicon podcast um about like kind of the relationship between capital and race, which is what's called racial capitalism. Which if you're interested, you can check that out. It's with Professor Yaron Homan. And I did want to ask you, just kind of like to wrap things up about our discussion. So how does your examination of race, or I guess, and in general, but how does your examination of race and epistemology inform and impact fields such as education, science, and policy? So what's the external, almost real world implications of your work?
Yeah, good. So I just finished a book manuscript, which I sent off to the publisher, called Ignorance of Racial Injustice, Why It Persists and What We Can Do About It. And in there, I diagnose or offer explanations of why ignorance of racial injustice is so persistent and so ubiquitous in society. And I kind of present a really pessimistic view of whether any one individual will change or their view or be disabused of racist beliefs or tendencies or something like this, or false views about racial injustice. So because of this pessimistic view, a solution that really one of the only solutions I see is a structural solution. That shouldn't be surprising because the problem is structural. So the solution should be structural. So I have very little confidence in people individually willing themselves to believe the right things, right? Why does any one person, you, I, or anybody believe what they believe? Well, they believe what they believe largely because of where they were born, who taught them, all of these things. So what does that suggest? Well, we should change the K through 12 curriculum in the US to do much better by way of presenting the truth about racial injustice. So, by that, I mean, like, you need a radical overhaul. You need to present information about Columbus, Jefferson, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, things going on in the last 10 years, right? This is not just an issue of the past. That all needs to be presented much more thoroughly. And also the way that this information is presented, where, folks like Jefferson aren't subject to being blamed for their racist beliefs or actions. I think actually blame is a component that's totally lacking, right? We should know that these people were blameworthy for what they're doing. And I happen to think that blameworthy or attributing blame plays this very critical role in why, and people coming to learn about what the moral truth is and about things like racial injustice. So yeah, to answer your question, yeah, we need to have a structural change in society and how this information is presented.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And hopefully, with like information, or with like programs like the College Board, what they're instituting, also with the the California college system requiring ethnic studies for high schoolers to be taken, are definitely good steps in the right direction. And hopefully there can be like more rigor in terms of those courses. And also, I think a component of care from students to actually want to learn about these things, to not reinvest in sort of the same sort of racist tropes that have been consistent throughout high school, or just in K through 12 education as a whole. And I think also an aspect of that is like seeking to learn more. There's a lot of things that education is not able to do. So you just have to take, the onus is also on you as an individual in the system to like study about these things. I think there's a lot of merit to that, I think, for sure. And I did want to wrap things up, the last question, and just ask you, what are you doing now? I mean, you talked about this book manuscript and how that's, well, good, first off, good luck on that, and that process. I know that can be really, really difficult sometimes, I think. And then I also wanted to ask about the Dominican Philosophical Association, what that is, and if high schoolers can potentially join that as well.
Yeah. So right now I am developing a view of racial metaphysics about what race is. So we talked a lot at the beginning of the conversation about social constructionist views, and I have a kind of a realist view which is a social constructionist view, but which differs from some of the others' views. So I'm calling it I'm developing a theory of race, and I call the view a causal constructionist view, or a theory of race that's causal. And here I'm taking machinery from other parts of philosophy and thinking through that machinery about race. So yeah, I'm doing some work in racial metaphysics and other work in the epistemology of ignorance that has to do with racial injustice. I'm continuing that. And then in terms of the Dominican Philosophical Association, I'm trying to get that off the ground because in the US and especially in Latin American philosophy, there has been a large gap in terms of Dominican philosophy. So there's this English language Latin American philosophy literature in the US, which is kind of, maybe let's call it burgeoning right now, or at least growing and becoming more widely taught and engaged with. But this literature has almost, well, really no contributions from Dominican philosophers, despite the large role that Dominicans play in Latinx culture across Latin America, but especially in places on the East Coast and from New York to Miami, or even here in Boston. So yeah, I'm trying to bring people together in this association who either are interested in Dominican philosophy, who work in Dominican philosophy, and Dominican philosophers in the US and on the island of Hispaniola, right? So I'm trying to bring this all together to kind of maybe get a critical mass of folks working to fill this gap in the Latin American English language philosophy literature.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a great initiative. And then do you have any plans maybe for including youth into that, or is that just for like recognized philosophers or people who've studied philosophy?
No. So anybody who wants to join the Dominican Philosophical Association can. I think actually, I would say that any association that's interested in promoting any kind of philosophy should be including youth as often as possible. And I think there is a movement in philosophy right now to push for more philosophy in high schools, even maybe philosophy earlier in the educational career students than high school. And I think that's all to the good. I think it's the field. And if you have any faith in philosophy, society would be a lot better off if we got people involved in philosophy at a much younger age.
Yeah, definitely, which is exactly why this podcast exists. So, that sounds like a really, really awesome initiative. And, if anyone, is from the Dominican background and would love to join, you can definitely reach out to Dr. Garcia. Their email is on their website, which I will link in the description and, in the description box. But that about wraps up our discussion today. Thanks so much, Dr. Garcia, for your time today. And, I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did as well.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.